Hey, my friends, it's Matt. This is the 10-Minute Bible Hour podcast. And as many of you know, I live in the beautiful Black Hills of western South Dakota. It's sort of the first wave of the Rocky Mountain formation that makes up so much of the Intermountain West. It's just gorgeous, and there's tons of interesting history here. This is the legit Wild West. Stagecoach robberies, gold rushes, brothels, shootouts, cowboys and Indians, all the things that you associate with this part of the world and the legends that go with it. It all happened here. So as a result, tons of very interesting movers and shakers throughout history in the late 19th and early 20th century stopped by here to seek their fortune or see what they could glean from it. And what that means is, as you drive around the Black Hills now, it seems like every little building has a plaque or something that's like, on this spot, on this date, future President Teddy Roosevelt stopped by for a sandwich at a cafe that used to stand right where that porta potty is now. And so the formula of all of these different places claim to fame around the Black Hills is someone very important plus an interesting incident that happened equals this is really significant. Likewise, in the book of Haggai, we get the impression that the Second Temple, though it's not as impressive an edifice in its original form as Solomon's Temple, the first one, still Haggai is saying this one is going to be even more glorious, something even more amazing is going to happen here. And the formula ends up playing out to be Jesus of Nazareth, God in the flesh, plus the culminating events of the story of the Gospels that happen in, around, and in the shadows of the temple equals the thing that brings about the redemption of all of mankind and the realization of the Messiah, and it's the most important event in all of cosmic history. And well, that's the claim to fame of this great and glorious place that is the Second Temple. But that still doesn't get us from the 500s BC up to the time of Jesus. And what you and I are doing right now is tracing the story of the temple so that we can better understand the home stretch of the book of Matthew. If we want to go further down that road, it's actually Haggai's neighbor in the Bible, just one page to the right here, and his contemporary, Zechariah, who points us toward where the story goes next. Now, Zechariah is an important book. As you and I have discussed here before, I think it has the most messianic references, prophecies of anything in the Old Testament. It's a much longer book than Haggai. But in chapter 9, it looks like Zechariah is alluding to this gigantic political, global, military shakeup that was going to come a couple centuries after he was writing in the form of the Macedonians led by Alexander the Great. Zechariah does not mention Alexander by name, but there's a whole bunch of language here about what's going to happen. For the sake of time, I'm going to invite you to go and read all of Zechariah 9 for yourself. But historically, it's largely been agreed that the first part talks about Alexander the Great and his conquest. The second part talks about the political fallout after Alexander and how that affects God's chosen people in the temple and everything else. But let's step back from that for just a second and follow Zechariah's prediction with a little bit of well-known history. Cyrus the Great is the Persian leader who topples the Babylonians led by Nebuchadnezzar. The Persians' capitals are Susa and Persepolis. The book of Esther unfolds in this political moment. And it is Cyrus the Great who sends the Jewish captives home to go and rebuild the temple. Ezra, Nehemiah, Zerubbabel, that crowd. Cyrus the Great dies and is replaced by his kid Cambyses, who's around for about 7 or 8 years. Then some pretender tries to usurp the throne right after him. I don't remember that guy's name. That doesn't last very long. And one of the great leaders in all of human history, Darius the Great, comes to the throne of Persia. He gets mentioned a whole bunch in the Bible as well. In fact, I think he's probably who is in charge. I'd have to look that up, but I think he's in charge when Haggai and Zechariah are actually physically putting pen to paper and writing down the stuff that they write down. Several more significant Persian leaders come and go in the 400s BC, including Xerxes, Artaxerxes, and a second and a third version of each of those. The famous clashes with the Greeks that include the 300 Spartans, the Battle of Thermopylae, the Battle of Salamis Straits, where Themistocles, the great admiral of the Athenians, defeated the forces of the Persians. All of that kind of stuff happens there in the 4th century, and effectively it looks like the Western Greek culture is going to succeed in fending off the reach and influence of the great Persian culture in the East. But then as we get into the late 400s and into the 300s BC, though philosophy is flowering amongst the Greeks, and even military sophistication and democracy and advances in government, they still can't get along. There is no Greek empire because they're all just individual city-states or leagues of city-states, and they fight against each other with a bunch of stupid squabbles that keep them relatively weak and vulnerable. And then it is a non-Greek named Philip II of Macedon, the guy for whom the New Testament city of Philippi is named, who sees the opportunity to conquer the Greek homeland. And he comes south from modern-day Macedonia, and he wins. He doesn't last very long because he gets killed, and then his 18-year-old son, Alexander the Great, who was personally tutored by Aristotle. Aristotle was personally tutored by Plato. Plato was personally tutored by Socrates. So it's a pretty intelligent group of people here. This young 18-year-old Alexander's like, I'm going to see through my dad's ambition, and we're just going to go conquer the whole world and unify it and Greekify it. And so he goes on this massive campaign of conquest against the great-great-great-great-grandson of Darius I, who goes by the handle Darius III. And they meet in a couple of decisive battles in the 330-ish range at Issus and Gaugamela. And Alexander scores massive victories, sending Darius away in shame. Ultimately, Darius dies, and Alexander bloodlessly conquers Jerusalem in the process, establishes Alexandria in North Egypt, and then goes and sets himself up as emperor of, I guess, everything in Babylon. He continues east. He fights in India. Eventually, he spreads Greek culture and language the whole way, intermarrying people and changing the landscape of planet Earth for all of time. Then he comes back to Babylon, and without naming an heir, he dies in 323 BC. Power abhors a vacuum, so Alexander's generals sit down at a table, or maybe they bicker a little bit more than that, and they divide up all of Alexander's empire into smaller territories that they each get to control. In a way, I suppose that was good because it prevented global war, but it also creates all kinds of conflicts with the places that got conquered, specifically the land of the Israelites, Jerusalem. Well, they got a new temple there that's now only a couple hundred years old. And even though the people of Israel welcomed Alexander to town and were happy to see him come, there was still a big question mark as to what the policy would be moving forward, because though the Persians had been a little bit difficult at times, the deal had been pretty good, and the Jewish people had enjoyed a degree of autonomy from the time of Cyrus the Great to the time of Alexander the Great. That's a 200-year span. That's like almost as long as America's been around, and it was a nice stretch for them. Well, now the Persians are out of the picture and Alexander's out of the picture. What are his generals going to do? And so, fully acknowledging this is a little bit of an abrupt pause point here, what we are seeing is that Haggai is pointing us toward a place whose claim to fame isn't just going to be the building, but the claim to fame is going to be all of the story that swirls around it, plus the character of Jesus. And when you put those two things together, something very culminating is going to happen in the grand redemptive story. And theoretically, we're getting closer and closer to a place where we can better appreciate the grandeur of that culminating event as we put in the work to understand the story of the temple. We're going to pick up right where we left off tomorrow and keep going on this thing. I'm Matt. This is the 10-Minute Bible Hour podcast. Let's do this again soon.